I'm Peter Elbaum, and I've spent the past 5 years working as a software engineer. But a couple weeks ago, I told my company I was leaving my job and I don't have any real plans for the future. From not knowing anything about technology to going through a coding boot camp to becoming a senior engineer, this is the story of where I've been, how I got here, and where I'm going. So in order to explain how I got here, I need to take you back a little bit to a time before I was a developer. So I've talked about this on the channel a little bit before, but I studied Spanish as an undergrad in college, and when I graduated, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I ended up teaching high school Spanish in a private school for a year, and then I worked in foster care for a year. It was during that year in foster care that two really important things happened that set me on the path to where I am today. The first thing was that I started learning about personal finance because I was making $12 an hour at only 25 hours a week, so this foster care job was actually part-time, and I was having to supplement my income with tutoring. Money was very tight, and so for really the first time in my life, I started to think a lot about my personal finances, how to save, how to spend, and I discovered Mr. Money Mustache for the first time. Now, if you're familiar to personal finance, Mr. Money Mustache is kind of the head of the FIRE movement. He is like the king daddy of them all. FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And he is one of the first people that really made this idea popular through his blog, which is very famous and well known in the personal finance space. Without going too far into it, Mr. Money Mustache and people in the FIRE movement basically say that you can retire far early than you thought possible if you live below your means and invest in passive index funds. And this idea of retiring early was really appealing to me at the time, mostly because I was hating my job. And so the thought of being able to stop working 20 or 30 years earlier than most people was super inspiring and really motivating. That idea, the idea of financial independence, is really closely related to the other thing that happened that year, which is that I decided to become a developer. Now, partly, as you might guess, I decided to become a developer because it pays really well. It's a solid job in a growing industry. The demand for developers was strong at the time. This was like in 2015, and it's strong now. It might even be stronger now. And so I felt like that was a really good career move. The other reason I decided to become a developer is because as a person with a Spanish degree from college, I didn't really have any career direction. I'd done this teaching job for a year, and I'd done foster care for a year, and I really had nothing to show for it, no real new skills, and I didn't have any direction. And the fact that I didn't have a clear path out in front of me was driving me crazy. It was making me kind of feel like a failure. And so these two things, wanting financial independence and wanting a solid career direction, led me to eventually decide to become a developer and go to a boot camp. So in the fall of 2016, I went to coding boot camp. I graduated, and I've been working as a developer for over 5 years now. During the first few years of my career, I began to save and invest according to FIRE principles, and I also worked on a couple of side hustles that never really went anywhere. A really crucial thing that happened during this period is that I discovered indie hackers and realized that there's a bunch of people out there making a living full-time from creating their own software projects. And this was a revelation to me for many different reasons. One of the reasons was because I was trying to do side hustles in areas that weren't related to software development at all, and I was really struggling with that, struggling to come up with the right idea and apply skills because I didn't have skills in the things I was trying. And so finding this community and seeing, hey, there are people that aren't even necessarily amazing developers, but they're using code to create businesses and make an income, was super inspiring, and I began to think more and more about starting a software business. After I discovered indie hackers, my thoughts on the FIRE movement started to change because FIRE is very future focused. It's basically just work, save, and invest, and after 10 or 15 years, due to the 4% rule, you'll be able to retire. And I never really liked that completely because it takes the focus out of the present and what you can control now, and it's totally future focused. And I realized through indie hackers that there's a lot of people that are working on their own terms now, still making a living. And when I began to think about it a little bit, I realized that that is actually far more appealing than just working, totally looking to the future for hope and aspiration and enjoyment. I realized that there was something kind of unhealthy about that for me. And so I began to think more and more about a business that I could build in the present rather than completely completely looking towards the future. After a couple years, I got the job that I have right now, and I've been at it for almost 3 years. This has been by far the best job I've ever had, but I knew that I wanted to try entrepreneurship sooner rather than later. So for example, whenever I had colleagues that would leave, we would talk about kind of future career aspirations. I would always tell people that I hoped that the current job I have would be my last real job of my life. And so I knew that after I was done with this job, I wanted to try working on my own terms, working for myself, but I didn't know quite when that would happen. And then something happened that changed everything.
Now to growing concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
So yeah, as we all know, the pandemic happened, and that really accelerated things as far as leaving my job went. First, nothing really changed. I actually was pretty worried about losing my job just because, if you remember back to that time, we didn't all know what was going to happen. It wasn't clear that the economy would sustain the disruption that the pandemic caused. And so for the first 6 to 9 months, I was actually kind of concerned about being out of work. But then once things settled down, something that was clear was that remote jobs were totally ubiquitous. And that was a big change for me just because when I first got this job, I really felt like I'd won the lottery. Don't get me wrong, I'm really grateful for my job, but something that was really unique about my job, or felt unique when I got it, was that it was totally remote. It was remote first. I was hired to be here at home and not go to an office. And that was so rare, and it was something that I wanted so much that when I got my job, I really felt like I had to hang on to it because the situation was just so good, and working remotely seemed so rare at the time that I just felt like I wasn't going to get another opportunity like the one I've had for the past 3 years. But once remote work was common and everyone was doing it, I kind of felt like I could take some risks and like I didn't necessarily have to hang on to this particular job forever. That's kind of a minor detail in this whole thing though. Even more than that, I really started to think a lot during the pandemic about work. I started a Substack newsletter in April 2020 that I eventually moved to my own website, and I basically just treated it as a public diary. I talked about whatever happened to be on my mind that week, and over time, now I've been doing it for 2 years, the theme of the newsletter ended up converging on work. So I ended up writing a lot about work, and it turned out that was because work was on my mind a lot. I started to question the conventional advice around schooling and work and everything in between. And yeah, I questioned the defaults. I questioned why work is a 40+ hour a week thing and why people end up building so much of their life around work rather than the opposite way. I won't belabor all the points, but if you're interested, you can check out the newsletter section of my website and see kind of how my thinking has evolved. I also started to do more reading online around this time, and I was exposed to new people and ideas, and 3 of these ideas in particular, I would say, are the most responsible for influencing me to quit my job right now. In no particular order, they are Naval Ravikant and the Navalmanac, Daniel Vassallo, and Wait But Why. So I've talked about all of these on my channel at varying times, but just starting from the top, giving kind of a synopsis of each. Naval, the idea that stood out particularly from him was this idea of equity and ownership. So there's this part of Navalmanac where he basically talks about how if you don't have equity in a business, you don't have a path towards financial freedom. And once this idea took hold, it really changed how I saw work and my job. And more than anything, the point of this idea for me is that if you don't own equity, then you don't get to participate in the upside. And so for me, I started to look at my own situation, and I realized that no matter how hard I worked or how much I busted my butt to please clients or customers, if I didn't own equity in the business, then I didn't get to participate in the value that I was creating beyond my salary, which, to be fair, it's a good salary. I make pretty good money. As I mentioned, that was one of my motivations for getting into engineering, but this idea really took hold. And I realized that there's value that I wasn't creating, that I wasn't capturing. And I realized that I wanted to start trying to capture more of the value I create directly. Now, one caveat is that that's because I work for a private company, and if I worked for Apple or whoever, then I'd get paid in stock. And so I think that's a fair way to participate in the upside. So there are ways of doing this as an employee, But for me, I just kind of realized that I wanted to be master of my own fate as far as the value capture and creation piece was concerned. The second thing that's really influenced me that I mentioned is Wape at Why, and specifically this blog post, The Tail End. And the idea behind this particular blog post is that when you count up your life and you count up the time you've spent with the people that you care about the most, the odds are that you're in the tail end of that time, so probably the last 10%. The thinking is that when you grow up with your parents, for example, you see your parents most days, but if you count up the times you see them now, like for me, I live 8 hours away from them, so in a good year I'll see them maybe 15 days, and you compare that with all the days I've already spent with them, the reality is that we're in the last of our time together, even if neither of us is really that close to the end of our lives. This one really hit me, especially because of the pandemic at large. I think what the pandemic has shown us is that life is fragile and vulnerable, and that tomorrow is not guaranteed. And when I really started to think about this blog post, which I'll link below, it hit me that I wanted to prioritize seeing my parents and my sister and the rest of my family as much as possible. And I wanted that to be quality time. So even though I work remotely and have flexibility, when I would go see my parents and I didn't take PTO, I would still have to be really focused on getting my hours in. And I just wanted more flexibility. I didn't want to have to work every single day. If I happened to be with them, I wanted to be able to focus on them and not worry about putting my 8 hours in. And I wanted to be able to just take off work without having to ask permission. So for example, I'm helping one of my family members move this year and I'm really excited about that. And I didn't have to figure out my PTO days and all this stuff. I can just do it. And so I'm really excited to be able to do that kind of stuff and prioritize the relationships that are important to me, and that's a really big part of the reason why I decided to go out on my own. The last person or idea that's had a really big influence on me as far as this is concerned is Daniel Vassallo. I think the overarching idea from Daniel is basically that you don't have to have it all figured out, and in fact your idea probably isn't that good and it's probably going to fail. And this was important for me because I always felt like, well, I have to have everything figured out before I leave work and go out on my own. And he was a person that didn't have it figured out at all. He didn't have any ideas what he was going to do when he left his job at Amazon, and he ended up figuring it out. In fact, in the course, he told us to treat our ideas like cattle, not like pets, which my family thought was funny when I tried to explain to them. But I think the point is we don't know what's going to work out and what isn't. And so this idea kind of freed me from this self-imposed rule that I'd put on myself to not only have an idea, but to have something working before I left full-time employment. And many indie hackers do that. Many people have a business that's covering their expenses or whatever it may be beforehand, but I didn't want to have to put that pressure on myself before I let myself take the leap. And so this was kind of freeing in that regard. It gave me the confidence that this could work even if I didn't have it all figured out. There's a lot I could say about all three of these people / ideas, but the point is I'm really grateful that I came across them, and I'm grateful for the way that they've kind of combined together to influence me and convince me that right now is the right time. Let's go back inside to talk about what I'm going to be doing next and how I'm going to make money. Okay, so what is the plan and how am I gonna live? When people ask about what I'm gonna be doing, I typically just say I'm going to be pursuing a combination of freelance work and working on my own projects. And that's true, but the reason I put it that way is just because it's simpler, it's easier to understand, and I don't have to go into my whole philosophy that I just explained to you. The long-term goal is to have a portfolio of income-generating projects, but the short-term goal is just to pursue this for as long as I possibly can. So I don't know quite what'll happen, but I'm considering it an adventure, and I'm excited to be stepping out on my own for the first time. One question you may have that I did want to address is what will this mean for the channel, considering that most of my content is around pursuing software development as a career? My answer to that would be I still have the knowledge I can share with you, and I still am happy to do that. I just realized that it wasn't something I wanted to pursue right now for myself. With all that said, if what I'm doing sounds interesting, then please feel free to subscribe and follow along. And also please feel free to ask me questions, and they may even turn into a video. Thanks for following along with me up to this point. I'll see you in the next one.